going to move into the next segment of our debrief from the American College of Rheumatology, ACR Convergence 2021, with myself, Tiffany, Deb, and Katie, all persons living with rheumatic diseases. And this segment, we're going to talk about the brain. I made an awkward silence on purpose because we're talking about the brain. Okay, so the brain. And initially when I saw this, my first went to brain fog, because that is often contributed to lupus historically. But over several years, there has been a lot more research into brain fog as it relates to rheumatoid arthritis and other diseases as well. But this wasn't necessarily about the fog, which I went, okay, still interesting though. So there were two studies that I pulled up here. I'm going to actually have them in order. If you wonder why I look over the sites, because that's where I have all of the information. Because if I'm here, then I don't get to really see Katie and Deb. So I've got it on a different computer pulled up here. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is called, where do I have it here? Where do I have it? I didn't hide. Okay, got it. Sorry. Okay, the first one I have here is the central nervous system dysfunction in the brain or blood-brain barrier in lupus. And so the first thing that I just want to clarify, the blood-brain barrier, or BBB, and for those who follow us, we are linking to we are going to be providing information as that kind of a glossary that we have to help you navigate conferences. So BBB is going on there. And essentially it's the blood vessels that are involved in the brain and the central nervous system. And they have unique qualities that create a barrier with a variety of cells. And those cells form walls that of those blood vessels, and so these interactions happen. So there's a lot of scientific, but that's about as I'm looking at how I broke that down. Because we as patients, I don't think we need to know anything more than that. There's a barrier, there's cells in our blood vessels, and there's a connection between what's happening in that area of our brain. Okay, so for these purposes, I think that's enough to know. So understanding how this blood-brain barrier interacts is essential for understanding how the function, and particularly if we're having central nervous system issues in our diseases, is where in the brain is this happening. And so by understanding that, you could obviously treat it, maybe prevent it, which we love.
Bring it on. Yeah.
So in saying that, this particular study was presented, and the research team, the lead researcher, has been studying psychiatric lupus for quite some time. And what that really is you'll see a lot in symptom lists with lupus. It'll say psychiatric issues, and then in parentheses it'll say like seizures, strokes, and they have depression in there as well. And so that is different than your classic brain fog. But it can lead to symptoms of that cloudiness, right? So I just want to clarify when we say that word, that's what they're talking about, something a little bit more clinical. And it's important for this study to understand that difference. So basically, in the past, they've used MRI imaging to look at the brain. So you have the structural. So there's different kinds of views that you look in the MRI. The structural is going to, the structure, it's going to tell you, kind of what you're going to look for, like brain damage, for example. And then you have the functional MRIs, and the functional are going to help identify different brain areas and different processes associated with how the brain is working. So the research team thought, well, we can't really get much about why this is happening, and if it's happening in this location of this BBB, this blood, that's hard for me to say. I mean, I keep wanting to say brain first, blood-brain barrier. And so they said there's not a lot that's on looking in the functional. Let's look at the functional. And so in saying that, let me scroll down to my little findings here. What they were able to find is that certain lupus patients with some level of cognitive impairment, oh my goodness, it's late in the day. Are showing to have abnormal brain activity and functionality at rest. And that's something also I should say at rest, because functionality allows you to measure activity, where more than the structure, it's just the structure. So at a resting state, they're seeing more of this activity in that specific area.
That's interesting. Just at rest.
Yes. So that what I found fascinating, why I wanted to bring this one up specifically to all of us as people living with the diseases, is that most doctors, from what I understand from listening to questions and answers on this segment and some reviews afterwards, is that rheumatologists don't necessarily diagnose that comorbidity specifically as the psycho. I don't want to say it wrong. Sorry, I gotta go back. Neuropsychiatric lupus, that comorbidity, and they will do it if there's an episode, if there's a seizure, if there's something major, a major situation that happens. So when they went back and looked at the data of these people, and I wish I had the number in front of me and how many they studied, but it was almost half had some evidence of this happening in the area, but only a few had actually been diagnosed with this I'm going to mess it up again. This, I need to just have it in front of my screen. This neuropsychiatric lupus. So if you don't know you have that diagnosis, right, then how are we going to start studying and treating it? So the takeaway for me, in addition to just being novel, needed research, was that there were a lot of questions that the doctors had about the specific, well, how many were diagnosed with this versus how many we saw. And that was where the big wow really came in. And then the question was posed, which we have seen in other sessions coming up a lot this time, well before, but I just noticed it more this time. And that is, how do we get research into the clinic? And so there was some conversation about, well, I mean, we're doctors, we can't just order an MRI necessarily if the person hasn't had an episode, right? But now we're showing that almost 50% of these patients are candidates if that is truly happening in that area of the brain. So there's a lot of research that still needs to be happening in this, but I think as people living with our diseases, and again, this is stuff that can be translated. So we're already seeing brain fog and other types of neurologic issues and cognitive issues happening in rheumatic diseases because of inflammation. So if we're finding the research in this one disease, then that is a building block to being able to understand these phenomenon if it occurs in other diseases as well. But good news for lupus, because that is a prominent feature that is listed often as a symptom, but we don't hear as much about that as you do brain fog, and they really are two different things. So I don't know if either one of you had any comments or any additions to that.
No, I mean, it is really good news for lupus. That's really interesting. Just again, another way that the brain is connected to the pain and how it shows up and things like that. It's been interesting. This is just, again, more information about that, which I like.
Yeah, very exciting to see where this is going, and again, hopefully leading to prevention or better treatment, better awareness of what to look out for. But I can also, when you said MRI, I'm like, oh, patients won't like that. They're expensive, they're time consuming, they're kind of daunting. Like an MRI, what? And another thing to deal with. So it's like great, but also kind of like, okay, getting ready to fight another thing.
One of the things that one of the rheumatologists had said when, for other rheumatologists who were listening are part of it, was a suggestion, if there's another reason to be having an MRI, this is the perfect opportunity to scan for this. which makes sense. And that's another reason why I'm glad you said that, Katie, because it triggered me to remember, I think, as people living with these diseases, it's something that patients should have in their playbook as well, right? So if you're living with lupus, knowing that almost 50% of the persons that were assessed had this area in their brain that's highlighting as active, and those are people that they're showing some of these episodes, but yet not diagnosed. Bring it up to your rheumatologist.
Yeah, be proactive.
And again, the MRI is so specific. Just again, what it can see and identify is just mind-blowing in itself. Yeah, I agree.
So anyway, that was just, it's one of those things that we like to mention, because when there's some novel research, then what will happen is a few years from now, we're going to see that built on. And that's when it really gets exciting, because I know Deb and I have seen, now being at these conferences so often, as you see all of a sudden something that happened a few years ago, when you see step 2, and it's just, you really can see how everything sort of evolves. So the other study that was around the brain was focusing on cognitive impairment. It was called cognitive impairment in patients with rheumatoid arthritis. And they also were using this clinical disease activity index that we were talking. Oh, wait, is this the one? Did I already say this one?
No, you haven't talked about this.
Okay.
We talked about it ahead of time.
So it's so funny, because I literally wrote the same thing. I'm like, whoa, that's strange. It was patients with early RA. And the cohort was referencing abstracts from, they mentioned that, patients are living longer with, in our aging population, which that's been a theme.
Aging.
Yep. That has been a theme. And it did not hit me until I read this piece of research. I just kept thinking, okay, well, aging, all right, they're bringing it up or whatever. But this specifically says that patients with, again, this is a study on rheumatoid arthritis, that have been starting treatment earlier and sticking and adhering to their treatments are having better outcomes. And as a result, their inflammation's lower, they're not getting the comorbidities as much with cardiovascular and all of the other things, hence they're living longer. And for those reasons is why we're seeing aging, because we're living longer. I'm like,
you're acknowledging it. Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so essentially, one of the other reasons I wanted to talk about this one is because it's a good example of how the research project works. So in addition to disseminating back what we learned, we do like to teach at the same time. And because as people living with the diseases, I think it's important to know how your treatments that are prescribed to you or recommended for you, where they all came from, and not just treatments like but pharmacologic, or how, if somebody's looking into your cognitive impairment, where did that come from? Is it, your doctor asked you in the office, but there's a reason. All this research happened beforehand, and how did it get to the office, to the clinical set? And so what they did is they started with what's called a literature review. So essentially, when you start research, before you do anything, you got to make sure you know everything that's happened beforehand. So they referenced something from 2018 where this literature research showed that there was not rheumatoid arthritis was not commonly associated with the central nervous system and brain changes, but there had been a number of studies that triggered them to look into this. And because the studies were showing that there were higher rates of cognitive impairment with people in RA, which I don't think surprises us.
No,
I think that part isn't news. But the point is, when they said, okay, we need to have, if we're going to have a hypothesis here on what we're going to study and what the outcomes, you've got to go back, and there's got to be a reason of why you're going to study this. So they felt that there was a reason, so they did a systematic they did a systematic review to identify who had been subject to this. So they essentially did it through databases. And I wanted to point that out as well, because our friends, Forward National Database, Holler, they have built and housed our own arthritis database so that we can conduct research. And this is a good example of why it's important when you have an opportunity to participate in data banks. It doesn't have to be research that's happening right this second. They track your experience long term. So they're following you for years, and you may not even realize it. But for example, they went to multiple databases, and they were able to pull out thousands of studies and things that we're being able to compare based on what was in these databases. So when you're filling this information out, just know that your information could be pulled for so many different things of value to build on. And it doesn't always mean you're going into get blood work or getting, certain, it can be as much as reporting, self-reporting stuff. So just because that factored into the process, it's not like it's an important outcome for the research per se, but it's important for patients to know your value and just participating in things like that, so that researchers can go back and pull information that you have submitted and be able to justify future research or future projects. Well, anyway, the conclusion was that there was evidence of the cognitive impairment in adults with RA. So as a result, further studies are needed. There you go. Hence, the study they did. So that's why
fascinating. That's awesome. And I also love the fact that they're looking back, because again, not wasting time and duplicating efforts, which again, we believe so heavily in as well. We don't want to duplicate anything that anybody else has already done. That's awesome. This is interesting, really interesting.
Yeah. So that's your typical way of doing the research and the steps. And again, I just wanted to, that's why it took me one of the reasons it took me 2 hours today to prepare for this, because I kept going down the rabbit hole with, because I was like, oh, this is a good learning opportunity. Okay, hold on. So then I was going back to all of the abstracts or the research that led up to the actual research that they were conducting here. So what was that research? So in this study, because again, our treatments are leading to longer disease life, we are also knowing that cognitive impairment is happening, and that can happen in an aging population. So this one, which I don't know if it was I think it was at EULAR 2021, I can't remember, but Deb, you brought it up, a study on Alzheimer's and dementia.
Yep. And
that has to do with
that was earlier this year. Yeah.
So that's where this led to, was a study on this. And essentially to be able to just remember we're aging, and the inflammation, if it's not under control, can lead to a lot of comorbidities. And when we're talking about cognitive impairment, it often can lead to dementia or Alzheimer's, which we saw, and we got to find that. We got to find that research that we talked about, because it was studying inflammation and how it's the cause of those comorbidities. So essentially, let me look at my notes here. Let me see here. Let me go back here and get down to the conclusion. All right, so the findings basically from the abstracts just were to grow the literature on the risks of this cognitive impairment and continuing tight control of inflammation and management of these comorbid conditions, and that represent strategies to really focus in on the risks, knowing you could be at risk. You're living longer, you have these diseases. That's an aging fact for a lot of people. And so it's just something to be cognizant of. We're not saying this or reporting this to make you scared or think, oh my gosh, is that going to happen to me? It's just know that it's something that's being, again, put on the table because researchers are realizing we're aging more. And that's everyone. The general population's living way longer.
Right.
then
Like the warning thing on the side of a prescription bottle. That's something, it's just kind of par for the course.
exactly. So
Good to know about.
Stay tuned. It's one of those again, ... If they just finished the literature review and they're just starting the research, I mean, it is early. And so, I predict the fact that there was a research study that was out at ULAR this year on this. Here we are finding more about it starting. My prediction is 2 to 3 years from now, when we do these debriefs,
we're gonna say, aha, yeah. That was back then, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So that's how it works. It's like you'll hear us a lot say, "Oh, back in this year we talked about this," but that's research takes time. So anything else on that? That was all I had. I just kind of I thought it was interesting point, and then an opportunity to teach everyone a little bit about the research process
and how that works, right?
Research to us.
Right. And again, that's all important stuff. It also brings in the whole databases again, which we are passionate about. That's, again, a big part of who we are too, and what Forward has done for us, and just the possibilities. It's endless.
Absolutely. As we go into the last, I'm going to ask Katie, do you need to get off and cook dinner?
No, I'm all set. Thank you.
Okay. She did tell us before she started that she had a time limit. So
I'm in a different time zone than the rest.
Trying to be respectful. Okay.
Thank you.